Julian Carter had spent years chasing stories that promised the truth, but none had ignited his curiosity quite like this one. He had always thought of himself as a man who could spot a story a mile away, someone who could smell the scent of a scandal before it even emerged. But when it came to Angelina Jolie, he hadn't expected to get caught up in the shadows of her life. She had always been an enigma, a person whose public image was polished and nearly untouchable. The world knew her as a global humanitarian, an actress whose career was legendary, and a mother whose family was the picture of perfection. But Julian's instincts told him there was more, something deeper hidden beneath that carefully constructed facade. It all started with a minor observation, a moment that, at the time, seemed insignificant, but soon set the wheels in motion. Julian had been attending a gala for a charity event in the heart of the city, where Jolie was set to make an appearance. The event was standard, full of celebrities, philanthropists, and influential figures from various industries. It was the kind of gathering where everyone wore their most polished masks, carefully curated to keep the public's admiration intact. But there was something off that night. Jolie, the woman everyone had come to know as the embodiment of grace and generosity, had been absent for the majority of the evening. Her arrival had been delayed, and when she did finally appear, it was only for a brief moment. Julian, always the observer, noticed how odd it seemed. She was barely seen interacting with the crowd or making the rounds. Instead, she was ushered quickly to a private space, away from the public eye. That was the first clue. For someone whose life was meticulously documented, this sudden retreat into the shadows felt out of place. Later in the evening, Julian found himself in conversation with one of the event's staff members. The woman, a mid-level assistant to the event organizers, didn't appear to be anyone with significant knowledge of the behind-the-scenes drama, but her slip of a comment caught his attention. She casually mentioned that it wasn't uncommon for Jolie to disappear for months at a time, vanishing from the public eye without any real explanation. "She's hard to track sometimes," the assistant remarked with a hint of nervousness in her voice. "She'll show up for a while, then poof, gone. No one really knows where she goes, but it's been happening for years." That was all it took. Julian's curiosity was piqued. A celebrity like Jolie, whose life seemed so transparent to the world, disappearing without notice. Something didn't add up. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew he had to follow this thread. For days after the gala, Julian couldn't shake the thoughts that had taken root in his mind. The more he reflected on the events of the evening, the more questions started to form. Where had Jolie gone? What could be so important that someone as high-profile as her would vanish without a trace? There was nothing in the public record that suggested any explanation for these absences. The media would occasionally remark on her busy schedule, but no one questioned it. The press never asked why she was so elusive, and Julian found that unsettling. At first, he tried to dismiss the feeling gnawing at him, reasoning that it was probably just another minor mystery that wouldn't lead to anything significant. But as the days passed, his thoughts kept returning to that brief exchange with the assistant and the strange absence of Jolie from the spotlight. Julian wasn't naive. He had been a journalist long enough to know that when things were hidden, in plain sight, they often led to the biggest stories. His first step was to look into Jolie's history, to search for any clues about her past that might explain her sudden disappearances. But the more he searched, the more carefully curated her public image appeared. There were no gaps in the timeline of her public appearances, no signs of scandals or controversies. It was almost as if everything had been designed to be perfect. Julian's frustration grew. Something was clearly missing, and the more he tried to dig, the harder it became to find any real answers. It was as if there was an invisible wall around Jolie, a wall that no one dared to challenge. He began reaching out to former colleagues, people who had worked with Jolie in the past. Most of them were quick to dismiss his inquiries, politely declining to offer any information. But there was one name that kept cropping up: Michael Harris. Michael had once been Jolie's personal assistant, a man who had been by her side during some of her early charity work. From what Julian could gather, Michael had left her employ under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and since then, he had vanished from the public eye. No one seemed to know where he had gone, and no one seemed to want to talk about him. Julian knew that if anyone could provide insight into the truth about Jolie's missing years, it was Michael. He had to find him. He began by following every lead he could find, tracking down anyone who might have had contact with him over the years. The search was frustrating. Every contact led to another dead end. People would give him vague answers, or no answers at all. It was clear that Michael Harris wasn't just an ex-assistant. He had somehow become a part of the story, part of the mystery surrounding Jolie's life. One evening, after weeks of fruitless searching, Julian found a clue that felt like a breakthrough. He managed to track down an old colleague of Michael, Harris, a man named Daniel Thomas, who had worked alongside him during one of Jolie's charity missions in Africa. Daniel, unlike the others, seemed to have no fear of discussing Michael. After some coaxing, Julian learned that Michael had abruptly left Jolie's employ just after a major public appearance she had made in the late 2000s. The rumors at the time had been that Michael had found something out, something that made him walk away from the lucrative job. What exactly that was, Daniel didn't know. But it was enough to make Julian wonder what Michael had stumbled upon during his time with Jolie. Julian's mind raced with the possibilities. Was there something about Jolie's personal life, something dark, that had caused Michael to sever ties with her? What had been hidden from the public during those missing years? And why had so many people avoided talking about it? The walls that had once seemed so impenetrable now appeared to be cracked, and Julian knew that the story he had stumbled onto was far bigger than anything he had ever expected. Jolie's missing years were just the beginning. Whatever secrets lay buried behind those years would soon come to light. He could feel it in his bones. The truth was waiting just beyond the surface, and Julian Carter was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Julian Carter sat in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of his laptop screen casting sharp shadows across his face. The name Michael Harris was now at the center of everything. If anyone knew the truth about Angelina Jolie's missing years, it was him. Yet, no matter how hard Julian searched, Michael had vanished as though he had never existed. Julian leaned back in his chair, frustration gnawing at him. He had spent hours combing through old articles, staff records, and event appearances, hoping to find some mention of where Michael had gone after leaving Jolie's employment. But there was nothing. It was as if someone had deliberately erased his presence from the public record. No social media, no job history, no known relatives willing to talk. Every lead ended in silence. The only real trace of Michael Harris was a brief mention in a decade-old interview, where Jolie had spoken about the people who worked closely with her during her humanitarian efforts. Michael's name had been listed alongside others who had helped coordinate her visits to refugee camps and disaster zones. But after that, his name disappeared completely. Julian tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking, if Michael had been involved in Jolie's work overseas, there had to be someone who had met him, someone who had worked with him before he vanished. He decided to start where most people avoided looking, those who had left the industry under strange circumstances. It took him several days to track down Daniel Thomas, a former security consultant who had once been assigned to one of Jolie's private trips to Eastern Europe. Julian had found his name buried in an old charity press release, mentioned as part of the security detail. Unlike Michael, Daniel had not disappeared, but he had distanced himself from his former work, relocating to a quieter part of town. Julian drove out to meet him, arriving at a small, run-down diner on the outskirts of the city. He spotted Daniel immediately, an older man with tired eyes sitting alone at a booth stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Julian approached cautiously, knowing that whatever he was about to hear would either push him forward or make him question whether this was a story he truly wanted to uncover. Daniel barely looked up as Julian slid into the seat across from him. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that told Julian he had seen things he wished he could forget. Julian wasted no time. He asked about Michael Harris, about his sudden disappearance, and about what he might have known regarding Angelina Jolie. Daniel hesitated, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup as if debating whether to speak at all. After a long silence, Daniel finally spoke. He admitted that he had worked security for Jolie on multiple occasions. He had been present during one of her lesser-known trips, one that had never been fully documented in the media. It was in Moldova, a visit that had supposedly been for charity work, yet something about it had never sat right with him. He remembered Michael Harris being there, handling arrangements, making sure Jolie moved unnoticed through the city. But by the end of the trip, something had changed. Daniel recalled how Michael had seemed troubled, uneasy in a way he had never seen before. There had been hushed conversations between him and Jolie, arguments that ended abruptly whenever others entered the room. Whatever had been said between them had been serious. Julian listened intently, his pulse quickening. If Michael had left Jolie's team after that trip, then whatever he had discovered had to be connected to it. He pressed Daniel for more details, but the man's face grew tense, his voice lowering. Daniel revealed that Michael had been seen one last time after returning from Moldova, visibly shaken. He had told a mutual acquaintance that he had stumbled upon something that he shouldn't have, something that made it impossible for him to continue working for Jolie. Shortly after, he had disappeared completely. Julian's mind raced. If Michael had uncovered something so dangerous that he felt the need to erase himself from existence, then Jolie's missing years weren't just about privacy. They were about something being covered up, something that had forced a man to abandon his entire life. Daniel looked at Julian carefully, his expression shifting into something close to pity. He warned Julian that there were people who didn't want this story to be told. Jolie wasn't just an actress or a philanthropist. She was someone with connections, someone protected. If Michael had vanished, it wasn't by accident. Julian sat back in his seat, absorbing every word. He had been chasing a mystery, but now it felt like he was chasing a ghost. Michael Harris was gone, and the only person who could answer why was Angelina Jolie herself. But how did one confront a woman whose life was built on secrets? Julian Carter sat in his dimly lit apartment, his desk covered in papers, notes, and printouts of old articles. The deeper he went into Angelina Jolie's missing years, the more he realized how tightly woven the secrecy around her had become. Michael Harris had vanished without a trace, and anyone who had worked closely with Jolie seemed either unwilling or too afraid to speak. Julian stared at the coffee cup in his hand, the liquid cold and untouched. He had spent the last 3 nights, barely sleeping, sifting through everything he had learned. Jolie's time in Moldova had been all but erased from public memory, and Michael's abrupt disappearance was far too coincidental. His gut told him that whatever had happened on that trip was the key to unlocking everything. He turned his attention to the photographs he had managed to retrieve, grainy, low-resolution images from the few sources that had documented Jolie's humanitarian efforts in the region. In one of them, she stood among a group of aid workers smiling for the cameras, but something about the image felt wrong. The background was blurred, but Julian could make out faint figures of men standing at a distance. They weren't part of the aid organization, nor did they look like civilians. They were watching her. Julian felt his pulse quicken. Who were they? And why was no one talking about them? Determined to push forward, Julian made a list of people who had worked with Jolie during that period. Most of them had long moved on, but a few names still remained within the industry. After several ignored calls, one finally led to a response. David Langley, a former logistics coordinator, agreed to meet. They met in a nearly deserted cafe on the outskirts of the city. David looked worn down, his face lined with age and experience. He had worked with Jolie on several projects, but it was clear that he wasn't eager to talk about her. Julian didn't waste time. He asked about Moldova, about Jolie's work there, and about Michael Harris. David sighed heavily before finally speaking. He admitted that Moldova had been different from other trips. The security had been tighter, the locations more restricted. He remembered Michael looking concerned, almost paranoid, towards the end of the visit. Whatever had happened there, it had shaken him. Julian pressed further, asking if Jolie had ever spoken about what went on during that trip. David hesitated before answering. He recalled a moment where Jolie had been taken away from the group for a private meeting. No cameras, no witnesses, just her and a group of men who had arrived in blacked-out vehicles. When she returned, she had been different, quieter, more distant. And then, not long after, Michael Harris was gone. Julian's mind raced. Who had she met with? What had she seen? David warned Julian that if he was smart, he would stop looking. Julie had built her career on being untouchable, and the people surrounding her were even more protected. Whatever Michael had discovered had been enough to make him disappear completely. Julian was digging into something that didn't want to be found, but Julian couldn't stop now. The closer he got to the truth, the more he realized that Jolie's missing years weren't just about secrecy. They were about survival. He left the cafe, his mind swirling with possibilities. He needed more proof. He needed to find out exactly who had met with Jolie in Moldova. If he could track them down, he could finally expose what had been buried. But as he stepped onto the quiet street, he felt something that made his blood run cold. A presence. Someone was watching him. He turned his head slightly, scanning the A car sat parked across the street, its engine running. He had noticed it earlier when he had arrived, but now, the presence of it felt deliberate. His instincts screamed at him. He wasn't just uncovering a story anymore. Julian Carter moved quickly, his breath shallow, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The parked car across the street had been idling too long, and the longer he ignored it, the more certain he became that it wasn't a coincidence. Someone was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He knew this feeling well. The moment when a journalist crosses a line. The moment when the story is no longer just words on paper, but something that holds real danger. He kept his pace steady, resisting the urge to break into a sprint. If he ran, it would confirm that he knew he was being followed. Instead, he turned the next corner, slipping into a small convenience store. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and for a moment he felt a brief sense of safety. He moved toward the back of the store, pretending to browse the shelves while keeping an eye on the entrance. The car didn't pass by. Whoever was inside wasn't interested in driving around the block. They were waiting. Julian pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He had spent the last several weeks tracking down leads, uncovering bits and pieces of Angelina Jolie's missing years, and now he was dangerously close to something that others had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. Michael Harris had disappeared after learning too much, and Julian feared he was about to meet the same fate. He took a deep breath and dialed a number. David Langley, the former logistics coordinator, had been hesitant to speak the last time. They met, but Julian had the feeling he knew more than he let on. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. Julian clenched his jaw. He couldn't afford to wait. Instead, he sent a message. "You were right. Moldova wasn't just another charity trip. Something happened there, and people are trying to keep it buried. If I go missing, tell someone what you told me." He hesitated before hitting send. Then he slipped his phone into his pocket and exited the store through the back door. He needed to disappear for a while, at least until he could piece together the last parts of the puzzle. As he moved through the narrow alleyways behind the buildings, he replayed everything he had learned. Angelina Jolie had traveled to Moldova for what was supposed to be a humanitarian effort, but something had happened behind closed doors, something that had left her changed. Michael Harris had witnessed something that made him flee. The question that haunted Julian now was, what? He had searched through every available document, combed through archives, spoken to former employees, but the exact details of what had transpired remained just out of reach. He needed more than scattered accounts. He needed something concrete, a name, a connection, a location. Then it hit him. The blacked-out vehicles, the unidentified men. Who had they been? Julian quickened his pace. There had to be records, flight, logs, diplomatic meetings, security reports. something that would confirm who Jolie had met with in Moldova. If he could get access to those records, he could prove that her missing years weren't just a result of personal retreat, but something orchestrated. But the problem was where to find them. He thought about his remaining contacts, but he had exhausted nearly all of them. David Langley had already given him more than he should have. The only people who truly knew the answers were the ones keeping them buried. Julian knew what he had to do. He needed to go to the source, Angelina Jolie herself. Finding Jolie wasn't difficult. She was an international figure, and her movements, at least the ones the world was supposed to see, were carefully documented. She was currently in London for a private event, an invitation-only gathering meant for elite philanthropists and government officials. Julian had no invitation, but that had never stopped him before. That night he stood outside the venue, watching as luxury cars arrived one by one, dropping off the world's most powerful figures. Then he saw her, Angelina Jolie. She stepped out of the car, her presence as commanding as ever, dressed in elegance, flashing a brief smile to the cameras before moving toward the entrance. But Julian wasn't looking at her outward charm. He was watching the people around her. Security was tight. No surprise there. But then, his eyes landed on something that made his stomach twist. A man standing near her car. He wasn't one of the usual security guards. Julian had spent enough time researching Jolie's past to recognize him. He was one of the men from the Moldova photographs. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He was still in her orbit. Whatever had happened in Moldova, Jolie had not walked away from it unscathed. These people were still with her, still moving within her world, unseen by the public but ever present in the shadows. Julian made a choice. He moved toward the entrance, keeping his posture confident, blending in with the flow of guests. He knew he had minutes at best before security would realize he didn't belong. He needed to get close enough to speak to her, to say something that would force her to stop and acknowledge him. As he stepped through the doors, the warm glow of chandeliers illuminated the grand hall. Jolie was moving toward a reception area, speaking to diplomats, shaking hands. Julian edged closer, waiting for his moment. Then, just as he was within a few feet of her, someone grabbed his arm. A firm grip. Cold. Unyielding. He turned his head, slightly, and saw the man from the Moldova photograph standing beside him. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. He had gone too far. Julian's stomach knotted. He had known this moment would come, but he had pushed forward anyway. The man led him away from the main crowd, toward a quiet hallway, his grip never loosening. Julian considered his options, but escape wasn't one of them. Then, a voice cut. Through the silence, Angelina Jolie. She stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable. She looked at Julian, then at the man restraining him. She raised her hand slightly, a silent command. The grip on Julian's arm loosened. For a moment there was nothing but silence between them. Then, she spoke. "You should stop." Her voice was calm, measured. Julian felt the weight of everything he had uncovered pressing against him. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to ask about Moldova, about Michael Harris, about the men in blacked-out vehicles. But something in her gaze made him pause. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She was warning him. This wasn't just about her missing years. This was about the people surrounding her, the people who had made her disappear when they needed to, the people who had made Michael Harris vanish. Julian understood at that moment that if he took another step forward, he might not get the chance to take another step at all. He swallowed hard. He had come this far, uncovered so much, but the choice was no longer his to make. Jolie gave him one last look before turning away, walking back into the light of the grand event, where the world would continue to see her as they always had. Untouchable. Julian stood there, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had the truth, but some truths weren't meant to be told.